He abandoned his sick wife. Years later, he saw her on television and couldn't control his surprise and jealousy. So he came looking for her. That was his mistake. That I'm a 41-year-old male, software project manager, the kind of guy who looks completely unremarkable in a lineup. Medium build, keeps his head down, does his work. I've been described as steady, practical, low drama. I used to think those were compliments. I've since revised that opinion, because steady and practical, it turns out, are also words that can describe a man who is quietly, methodically terrible in ways that take years to fully surface. This story starts 8 years ago. I was 33, recently married, and my wife had just been diagnosed with early-onset rheumatoid arthritis. She was 31 when it hit. The diagnosis came about 14 months into our marriage, which meant we were still in that phase where you're figuring out the day-to-day shape of a life together. Morning routines, grocery preferences, which arguments are worth having and which aren't. And then, layered over all of that, specialist appointments, medication adjustments, the particular exhaustion that came with a body that had started working against itself. She handled it with a composure that I found, at the time, convenient. She didn't collapse. She didn't demand. She adapted, and she managed, and she kept most of the weight of it internal, which meant I could tell myself that things were basically fine. They were not basically fine. I just preferred the version where they were. Within 2 years, I had constructed an elaborate private justification for everything I was about to do. The marriage was too hard. We'd gotten together before either of us knew what the future held, and surely that meant something about compatibility. I wasn't built for this. I needed a partner who could be present in ways that a chronic illness complicated. I told myself these things with the sincerity of a man who had decided on the conclusion first and worked backward to the reasoning. I asked for a divorce when she was in the middle of a significant flare, joints swollen, sleep disrupted, in the middle of a medication transition her rheumatologist had cautioned would be rough for 6 to 8 weeks. I know how that timing looks. I knew then. I did anyway. The divorce was finalized in about 5 months. She didn't fight it. That was the part that stayed with me longer than I expected. Not the relief I'd anticipated, but the particular quality of her not fighting. Like she'd already understood something about me that I hadn't fully admitted yet. I moved to a different city. New job, new apartment, the clean slate geography that people pursue when they're running from something they've dressed up as a fresh start. I dated. I had a relationship that lasted almost 2 years and ended without drama. I built a life that looked, from most angles, entirely acceptable. I thought about her less and less. Or I told myself I did. Then, on an unremarkable Tuesday night about 6 months ago, I was eating dinner and half watching a business news program. The kind of background television you put on more for sound than content. The segment was about emerging entrepreneurs in the health technology space. Companies developing patient management platforms, chronic illness tracking software, that category. The woman they cut to for an interview was my ex-wife. I set my fork down. She looked, and I'm going to be precise about this because the precision matters. She looked extraordinary. Not because she'd changed dramatically in the cosmetic sense, but because of what she was projecting. Confidence so settled it didn't need to announce itself. She was speaking about her company with the fluency of someone who had built something real and knew every brick of it personally. She'd co-founded a health tech startup that had developed a monitoring and community platform specifically for patients managing chronic inflammatory conditions. It had apparently just closed a Series B funding round. The interviewer mentioned user numbers. I did the math on the valuation implication without really meaning to old project management habit and sat back. She had done extraordinarily well. The feeling that moved through me in that moment was not simple. I want to be honest about that. There is something that might be called pride, distantly, in the way you feel proud of a team you used to coach. There was genuine surprise. And underneath both of those, uglier and more honest, there was something that felt uncomfortably close to jealousy. Not romantic jealousy. Worse, the jealousy of a man who realizes the thing he dismissed as a burden had become, in his absence, something remarkable. The specific sting of understanding that his departure had not, in fact, been a loss for everyone involved. I told myself I just wanted to reach out and say congratulations. That would be mature, appropriate, a moment of real closure. I was lying to myself. Again, apparently that's a durable habit. I found her professional contact through the company's website. Clean, well-designed, the kind of digital presence that communicates seriousness without trying too hard. Her name was listed under co-founders, with a brief bio that mentioned her background in patient advocacy, which was not something she'd been pursuing when we were married. It was something she'd built from scratch, apparently using the years I'd been busy constructing my acceptable life. I drafted the message 5 times. Each draft started a little more casually than the last, which is what you do when you're trying to make something calculating look spontaneous. The final version landed somewhere between old acquaintances reconnecting and I saw you on TV and wanted to say I always knew you'd do great things, which was a lie, but a polished one. She replied 4 days later. The message was brief, professional, and warm in the specific way that maintains distance through good manners. She thanked me. She said it had been a long journey. She wished me well. That should have been the end of it. Here's the thing about men who have never fully reckoned with something they did. They have a profound capacity for mistaking a polite response for an open door. I replied, longer this time. I mentioned that I was in her city on a project the following month, true, as it happened, and that I'd love to grab coffee and catch up properly if she was open to it. No pressure. She didn't reply for 9 days. When she did, she said she needed to check her schedule and would get back to me. She did not get back to me. I told myself she was busy. She was, by any observable measure, very busy. I waited another 10 days and sent a follow-up, light and brief, just keeping the line open. She replied the next morning. Same warmth, same managed distance. Said her schedule was genuinely packed, but that she appreciated me reaching out. A reasonable man reads that and understands. I was not, in that period, being particularly reasonable. I want to be clear that I didn't do anything dramatic or alarming in the conventional sense. There were no grand gestures, no showing up uninvited. What I did was more banal and, in some ways, more revealing. I started tracking her company's news, press releases, industry coverage, a podcast appearance she made in which she talked, briefly and carefully, about the personal experience with chronic illness that had motivated the company's founding. She was precise about it. Never melodramatic, never pointed, but the shape of the experience she described was the shape of the years we'd been married. I had told myself, for a long time, that she'd been managing fine, that the illness was difficult but sustainable, that I'd made a reasonable choice given circumstances that were genuinely hard. Listening to her describe that period in her own words from a distance of years, with the clarity she now had, I understood that I had not made a reasonable choice. I had made a convenient one, and I had built a very careful story around it. That realization did something uncomfortable to me, and instead of sitting with it, I converted it, the way people do, into action, for momentum, because sitting with that specific discomfort was more than I wanted to manage. I reached out to a mutual contact from years back, someone who'd known us both during the marriage. I framed it casually, just curious how everyone was doing. Wasn't it wild to see her on TV, that kind of thing? The mutual contact was friendly, unsuspecting, and filled me in generously. She had a serious partner, had been together about 3 years. He was apparently also in the tech space, grounded, good with her. The mutual contact mentioned, without any particular inflection, that he'd been genuinely supportive through some of the harder health stretches of the past few years. Everything about that last detail landed precisely where it was aimed, even though it hadn't been aimed at anything. I applied for a position at a competing firm in her city. I told myself it was a career move. The timing was right. The role was a step up. The location worked. I ran through the justifications with the same efficient backward logic I'd used 8 years ago, and they sounded just as reasonable and were just as much cover for something I hadn't acknowledged. I got the job. I moved. And then I made the mistake that unraveled everything. I reached out to her company directly, not to her, but to her co-founder, pitching a potential integration project between my new firm and her platform. Her co-founder forwarded the inquiry to her. She recognized my new employer. She recognized my name on the proposal, and she was significantly smarter than I had, apparently, updated my model to account for. She made 2 calls before she responded to anything. The first was to a lawyer. The second was to her partner that I didn't know about either call for about 2 weeks. I was operating under the comfortable illusion that the business inquiry was in review, standard timeline. Nothing unusual. I'd started getting settled in the new city, had driven past her company's office building once, which I categorized internally as just orienting myself geographically, the way you do when you're not ready to call something what it is. The call that corrected my understanding came from her lawyer's office. It was not aggressive in tone. It was remarkably calm, which made it more effective. The attorney explained that my ex-wife had become aware of a pattern of contact over the preceding 2 months, that she had documented the sequence: messages, the mutual contact inquiry, the business proposal routed through her co-founder, and that she wanted to communicate clearly and formally that she did not wish to have any contact, professional or personal, and that any further attempts to establish either would be treated as harassment under applicable state law. The attorney also noted, matter-of-factly, that my ex-wife had already briefed her company's board on the situation, which meant the business proposal had been reviewed in that context and would not be moving forward. I sat with the phone in my hand for a while after that call ended. The thing about hearing your own behavior described by a lawyer is that it removes all the interior framing you've been applying to it. The just reaching out, just catching up, just a career move, just geography. All of that dissolved in about 4 minutes of calm, precise legal language, and what was left was the actual sequence of events, which looked considerably less reasonable from the outside than it had from the inside. I called my own attorney, not because I was planning to contest anything, but because I needed to understand where I stood. Where I stood, my attorney explained, was on thin ice that I had not yet broken through, but which would not survive additional pressure. The documented pattern was real. The cease and desist was formal and on record. If I made any further contact, direct, indirect, professional, or personal, she had sufficient documentation to pursue a harassment claim, and given the pattern, it would hold up. "What were you trying to accomplish?" my attorney asked me. Not judgmentally, just directly. I didn't have a clean answer. I said something about wanting closure. My attorney looked at me the way experienced attorneys look at clients who have just said something that doesn't survive contact with reality. "Closure is for therapy," she said, "not for showing up in someone's professional space without their consent." She was right. Obviously, the honest answer to her question was something I hadn't been willing to form into words yet, which was that I had watched my ex-wife become someone remarkable and had wanted, without any particular right to it, to be adjacent to that, to have some claim, however small, on the narrative, to not be simply the man who had left. But that's exactly what I was. That was the whole of what I'd earned. My ex-wife had, in the years since I'd walked away, built something real from exactly the circumstances I decided were too difficult. She'd taken the illness I'd treated as a burden and made it the engine of a company that was genuinely helping people. She found a partner who showed up. She'd constructed a life that required nothing from me and was better for it. And I had moved to her city. I sat with that for a long time. The mutual contact I'd reached out to earlier sent me a message a few days later, brief, notably cooler in tone than before, which told me that my ex-wife had said something carefully to people in the shared network. Not a campaign, not dramatic, just information distributed quietly, allowing people to update their understanding of the situation on their own time. Within 2 weeks, 2 professional contacts I'd been developing in the new city had become markedly less responsive. I couldn't prove a connection. I didn't need to. The social math was straightforward. She hadn't retaliated. She'd simply let the truth move at its natural speed. And the truth was that a man had followed his ex-wife to a new city, repeatedly ignored polite signals to disengage, and required a formal legal communication to stop. That's a sentence I had to learn to sit inside of. I'm still in the city. I want to be honest about that. I didn't flee, which would have been another evasion. I stayed, did my job, kept my head down in the way I'm actually good at when I'm not busy constructing elaborate rationalizations for bad behavior. I did the therapy. I want to mention that plainly because I think people treat it as a footnote when it should be close to the main event. 8 months in, working through the specific and unglamorous work of understanding why a man who considered himself low drama had spent 2 months conducting a quiet, methodical pursuit of a woman who had clearly moved on in a city she'd built a life in, using a business proposal as a Trojan horse. The therapy answer, reductive but not wrong. I had never actually grieved the end of that marriage. I managed it, processed the logistics, relocated, restructured. But the grief and the guilt underneath it, I compressed into a file I never opened. And when I saw her on that screen, something in me had mistaken the surge of feeling for something forward-facing rather than recognizing it as everything I'd refused to feel 8 years ago, finally insisting on being felt. She had become successful and whole and happy in my absence. And some part of me could not locate itself in that story and had tried, stupidly and selfishly, to insert itself anyway. That's the honest version. The legal situation resolved without further escalation. I had no further contact, which was the only correct move I made in the second half of this story. My attorney confirmed that the cease and desist had been noted and that no further action was anticipated as long as things stayed quiet. They stayed quiet. My ex-wife's company, from what I can observe through entirely public channels, press coverage, industry newsletters, continues to grow. The series be closed cleanly. There are reports of a potential Series C conversation. The platform's user community is apparently one of the more active in the chronic illness space. She built something that works, and it works because she understood the problem from the inside, which she only understood because she lived through it, which she only lived through because she had no other choice. I gave her no other choice. That's a strange and uncomfortable legacy to carry. But carrying it honestly is probably the minimum that's required. I don't know what she told her partner about all of this. I imagine she told him everything, given that he was clearly the kind of person who showed up, and people who show up tend to be told the truth. I hope she's well. I mean that without agenda, which is possibly the first time I've meant anything about her situation without an underlying angle. My therapist asked me recently what I would want her to know if there were a version of the world where saying something was appropriate, which there isn't. I said I want her to know that watching her on that screen, I was proud of her, and that I understood, finally, that the pride was not mine to feel, that I hadn't contributed to it, that I had in fact made the path harder, and that the accomplishment was entirely hers. That the person she became was built in spite of what I did, not in any way because of it. My therapist said that was a reasonable place to land. I think she meant it as encouragement. I took it as exactly that, reasonable. Not resolved, not redeemed. Just reasonable, which is probably what I should have been from the beginning, instead of learning it at 41 through a lawyer's phone call and a city I moved to for the wrong reasons. I'm still here, though, doing the work. That's the most honest ending I've got. If you've ever watched someone thrive after you walked out and felt something you weren't proud of, subscribe, because clearly we all need a safe place to be honest about it.